Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming at this time. I hope I don't bore you to sleep. Okay, so before I talk, because this talk I will have two parts. One part I'm going to talk about information security risk assessment. We can also call it ISRA. The second part I'm going to talk about lessons learned, which are tips that through our experience. So because we have 1 hour, we can spend a day to talk about this. Because we have 1 hour, I would like to ask our audience who know this subject. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar with ISRA? If more people are familiar, we'll spend less time in the first part. If less people are familiar, we'll probably spend a little more time to talk about the ISRA. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar with risk assessment? Okay, thank you. We have about 1/3 of people raise the hand, so we'll go as we planned. We probably spend maybe a little bit half time. And so last year, Josh and we had a joint talk. And this is more of a follow-up. We can talk about lessons learned, and it's more practical things. Last year we started to talk we were in the OWASP study group. And we have, I don't know, Josh, maybe over a dozen people. And we finished the session early, and we don't know what we're going to talk about. So I said, well, do you do this? Who knows about this? And then end up only Josh and I actually know the subject. So I think this is information security risk assessment. Remember, ISRA is one of the most important aspect of any of your software security program. However, it is probably the hardest one to do, and also it's least understood. So as a result, I can see teams will postpone it to the end or just skip it at all. And then the result is you deliver a software product, you have no idea what your potential risks are. So that's why I think I have practiced it for many years. The first security assessment I've done with a major product, I think is in 2009. Now we're 2017, so I have done this for many years. And I thought it's good for the community to share my knowledge and experience. So before we go in, a little bit about myself. I work for Gemalto. Gemalto is a security company. We provide products and services, security products and services, which are used by billions of people around the world. But most people do not know our products because you don't see them. I'm not going to do advertisement, but as a result, Gemalto, we take security very, very seriously. And we do a lot of risks, ISRA. And that's why I come to talk about this. And I'm an inventor. I have some patents and some patents pending. And long-time OWASP members and volunteers. Yes, and in this is an interesting picture. It's one of the most exciting time in my exciting time in my life. And in 2002, we have the Winter Olympics, which is in US. And then they have torch relay, and they start from Essen, I think, and then they run the relay around the world. So I was one of the torch barrier when the torch relay passed through Austin. It's very, very exciting. I couldn't find the other picture I was running, and a couple of bodyguard just surrounding you. And then you got your torch, you got your light from the previous torch barrier. You carry your the torch, you run, and then you lighten up the next one. It was quite interesting. In this talk, we're going to, as we mentioned already, we're going to talk about ISRA, and we're going to talk about some tips about doing it. Just a little bit context. As we know, this is a security conference. I'm preaching. Yeah. So you know that we have software runs everything, and in the cloud, in the Internet of Things, and mobile, and appliances, and everything, right? And on the other hand, because we have this software runs everywhere, and we have open platform, the Internet is open. For all kinds of reasons, we all know the risks are very high. And recently, we experienced 145.5 million users are affected because Equifax breach. And you can also see this. This is breach level index that Gemalto maintains. It published every 6 months. A very recent breach index, you can see we have almost 2 billion records breached in the first half of 2017, which is more than what the number of breached records happened in the whole 2016. Okay, in the whole year of 2016, if I remember correctly, is 1.7 something or 1.8 something. So the first half year. So as a result, so we're living in a sense in a high risk period. Maybe we all have high risk. It's just different period. We have different kind of risks. But the digital, your digital life is, and we have a lot of risks. And our customers requires, I guess many of you, you work for a company, you have your customers, right? And you probably know your customers demands better security. And if you're a software company, it's your security of your own software, regardless your security software or other software, the software for real estate, regardless what kind of software, or for insurance company, the security of your software may determine your fate. Okay, and look at the Equifax. They're not a software company, but they're using software, and this breach may determine their fate. I don't know what's going to happen. At least for the credit bureaus, they will have more regulations. Probably that's what Congress is talking about. Now, there are lots of risks. And then how do we manage the risks, right? In order to manage risks, we have to be able to assess it. We have to be able to know what are our risks. And then we can talk about manage risks. Without knowing and talking about management is just talking, right? You don't know what you're managing. You're going to manage. So ISRA will enable us to bring up the risks so that we can manage them, right? If you don't even know what it is, how you're going to manage it, right? And they also bring the accountability to management. So they can make conscious decisions, right? So it's very often, like in Equifax case, right? Their security team, they knew the struck vulnerability. They told their management. The security team, they actually pushed hard, but the management, I don't know what is the process. They did not evaluate the risk of this vulnerability. Somehow, maybe they evaluated, maybe they think the risk is low, so they did not pay attention, they did not address it. So you do the risk assessment, you can bring accountability to management. The security team, we told you, you didn't do it, right? And it's the management responsibility to make the decisions. And also, we'll see later, it will help us to prioritize our tasks. You may have 10 risks. Which one are you going to address, right? Another thing is important is actually it can provide a common language to different divisions of your company. For example, in Gemalto, we have different business units. In each business unit, we have R&D, we have operation, we have product management, right, and others, right? And the R&D team will talk with technical terms, right? The business people, product management people, they talk things in business terms. But risk is a common term that everyone can understand. That's why we talk about risks. We talk about assess risks. And then we can bridge the gap between the technical people and the business people. Okay, so we're talking about why we do this. Now, how does this, we're talking about the risk, we're talking about management, we're talking about business. How does it have anything to do with software? So when we build a product, okay, again, regardless what kind of software product you're building, we need to have security objectives. The most basic objectives, I assume because we're attending security conference, right? Remember CIA? That's the most basic, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability, and others, authenticity, and so on, so forth. So when you have a product, not only you want to have functional requirement, you also want to have security requirements. Failing to fulfill these fundamental security objectives leave your products vulnerable to security risks. That's how they relate it to software. Okay, and then when we say we need to do risk assessment, we need to do ISRA, what does that mean? What does that involve? So first, we need to identify potential risks, security risks. We need to evaluate them. And we're going to talk about it a little bit more. And then we identify these risks. We want to propose mitigations to reduce the risk level, or if ideally we solve the problem. Another important part is to make a risk management decision. So these are the three things when we say we do ISRA, that's the three things we want to cover, okay? I'm going to go a little bit more details on each of these items. So identify risks. We're talking about, let me define my scope, okay? So the scope, in this talk, I'm more focused on the software development. Right? I'm not in a consulting company. I'm not evaluating, I'm not doing pen testing. We're talking about doing ISRA even during the product development, okay? So that is my scope. And so the first thing, we want to identify the risk, okay? In order to do that, you want to think about it, right? The risk is something bad happens to you, right? Something bad may happen to you. You think about what are the bad things, right? And that in the software case, right? In your product, you deliver a product, or you're using a product. You can do risk assessment when you buy third-party product, right? You buy cloud service, you want to do risk assessment. The first thing you want to identify, you want to know what is it that you want to protect? What is it that you're worried somebody may want to damage it, right? So that's what we call asset, right? So for example, if your company provides some service, let's see for some health service, health information service, right? You will have patient personally identifiable information. That's what we call the PII, right? Let's see your service maintains some PII. You will be very much worried that somebody is going to steal patient's information, right? So that's one example, right? We use that example as the thing you want to protect. So that is what we call the asset, right? And then you want to think about it. Who want to damage your asset? Okay, it could be some malicious person over the internet you will never seen for whatever purpose. It could be your competitors, right? And it could even be researchers, or it could be a different government, some government, right? So you want to think about who wants to damage your asset. In this case, you want to think about who wants to steal your PII, for example. So that, the bad actor, we call the threat agent. And then, what does he want to do to damage your product, your asset? In our example, is we have PII, the personal data, and the bad guys wants to steal your personal data. So that is the threat, okay? So I just want to clear up the terms, right? So we have the thing you want to protect, we call it asset, and this bad thing might happen to our asset, we call that a threat. Then you want to think about it, how they're going to achieve this. How are they going to steal my asset, right? So the threat agent, he will look for vulnerabilities, right? And that's what we see on attackers. They will do they will search your product. They will do all kinds of testing. They will try to find out the vulnerabilities of your product. And then through that, if they can exploit the vulnerability, then that's how they actually realize their threat. Okay, so in Equifax case, they find the vulnerability. They still didn't patch the struct vulnerability, right? And there's many cases in some company. I'm not going to name the name. In some company, they are taking security seriously. It's not Gemalto, some other headline. And they take security actually seriously, and then they have all the processes in place, and they deploy the product around the world. But in one of the country, and they have a router, the router has default password. And then the attacker can just get in, right? So you just need to find out the weakest point. So through the vulnerability, the attacker will be able, realize that threat. In this situation, for example, you have PII, you store in the database, but it's not encrypted, it's in plain text. And so the attacker will exploit this vulnerability. This will leave the risk. So your risk in this case is the possibility of your PII being stolen. Okay, so these are the things we'll do when you do ISRA. You want to identify your asset, you can have a list of them, right? You have a product, either you develop or you're using. You identify the asset. You really, really want to know what you're trying to protect. Think about a house, right? In your house, you want to know what's in, what are the things, what are valuables in your house that you want to protect. It's the same thing. Look at the insurance company. They ask you to write a list of things that you own. So in case something happens, they know what to, they know how to compensate, right? So you want to know your asset, and also you want to find out vulnerabilities, and then you identify the risks. Okay, so there are multiple sources, multiple ways of identify vulnerabilities. I'm not going to, we don't have time to go through all of them, but this will give you a good reference. And one way, this is very important, especially if you develop software product or you inherit product. You want to do the architecture, and you want to analyze the architecture and its design to do security analysis. Remember, we talked about the fundamental properties. You want to look at confidentiality. You want to look at integrity protection. You want to look at the data protection. Okay, so you want to analyze your system. And you can, to do that, there's a free tool that you can use that will, so if you're not very familiar with this, you can use Microsoft threat modeling tool that you basically put on, these are my main components of my system and how they communicate. It will enumerate. Of course, it will have a large enumeration, so you want to do, you have to play with it, but that can be a starting point. And also, there's vulnerability database, that CVE, that may have vulnerabilities that relate to the products you are using. And also, it's importantly, all nowadays, even if you don't develop software, you use software products, and the software products, all of them using large amount of third-party software. And at any parts, it could possibly to have vulnerabilities. And you can use scanners and audit, you do pen testing. So there's different ways. And the CVSS is the most commonly used, the calculator to calculate the level of vulnerability. It will give you a number from 1 to 10. Okay, if it's, I don't remember, 7.5 to 10, it's a high vulnerability. And then you have medium and you have low. So that is the most commonly used vulnerability calculator that will give you a level of vulnerability. Okay, so we talk about the asset, we talk about the vulnerability, and what you're really interested in is the risk level. Because if for vulnerability, you have high vulnerabilities, right? For different business, for different product, what the actual risk may be different. So we'll look at you want to look at the risk. So there's a different way to evaluate risks. And one method is based on a standard, it's ISO 27005. So the definition of the risk is the impact on the likelihood plus vulnerability. They are not literally plus or multiplication. In certain cases, you can treat them literally, but just think about it. The likelihood itself covers many things. Likelihood is the vulnerability. You say, well, this system is vulnerable to certain attack, right? And the likelihood talks about how likely is this bad thing going to happen. What is the probability this bad thing going to happen? right? That's likelihood. So the likelihood would include how difficult the attack would be, right? To attack this system, to explore the vulnerability, how difficult it would be, right? The more difficult, the less likely it will succeed, okay? It can also include, does the attacker need what kind of the privilege the attacker would need, right? If the attacker need elevated privilege, and then it's harder to do. If anybody over the internet can do this, then the likelihood will be higher. So the likelihood can consider many different factors. And then the important part is what is the impact is if they exploit, succeed. If bad thing indeed happen, what is the impact? So the risk is the combination of these things. OWASP has a calculator, and it's a spreadsheet, literally a spreadsheet is a calculator, and then they have a list of questions, and you answer those questions. It will give you a score, okay? So it is important to evaluate the risk. If it's a high or critical risk, you want to manage it as soon as possible, right? That's give you a way. Normally, everyone, we all have very limited resources, so you want to you want to look at the risk level to decide which things to deal with first. Now you have you identified, let's see, 10 risks, okay? And now now what, right? You have to make a decision what to do with these risks. And it's very important to remember the risk management is a business decision. I'm a security architect. I can tell the product management team, these are the risks, but it's not my responsibility to make a decision. It is my responsibility to tell you what are the risks, what you can do to reduce the risk level. And, but it's the decision is based, it's a business decision, okay? So there's different ways to handle the risk. You can avoid it. For example, flying is, there's a risk in flying, right? And if you're so worried about it, you can decide just not to fly, right? And a friend of mine, she feels she's afraid of height. She feels it's very risky to be high, to be, I mean, not high on drugs high. It's to be on a high elevation. So yeah, it's a risk for her to pass out, let's see. And so she never drive on the highway, on highway, you know, the crossover. And she just drive around the neighborhood, passing that through. So that is a strategy, right? That's a risk management strategy. You avoid it, all right? So that's one way. And another thing is, another way is you transfer the risk, okay? And again, driving is risky, right? And somebody may bump into me and damage my car, damage his car, and damage some, you know, get bodily injury. And you can decide not to drive, and then it's not very convenient. So we transfer the risk. We buy insurance, right? We buy insurance. That's we transfer the risk to the insurance company. And I don't see Mike, but as a company, you have product, and then in certain situation, you can use contract to transfer the risk, certain risk to customers. And for example, you say, okay, as a customer, they need to, let's see, protect their private key, protect their password. Like AWS, we talk about AWS, right? And as an AWS consumer, user, company, and you have secret keys, right? AWS said explicitly, it is your responsibility to protect your private key, and that could be in a contract. That's another way of transfer risk, okay? And then they mitigate, right? That's what technical people will say, okay, these are the technical proposals. You can reduce the risk or you can eliminate them. And a lot of time is you may not completely eliminate the risk, but you may be able to reduce it. So that's mitigations. And it's basically apply controls or countermeasures. That's, for example, traditionally you put a firewall, right, in the application. And also like the door to eliminate it, to prevent somebody coming into your house to steal your gold inside the house, you put a lock, right? So that is a mitigation that it may not completely eliminate the risk, but it reduces the risk. So we also call the controls and the countermeasures, mitigations, that all belong to it's the same thing, basically. And you can also accept the risk, right? I accept driving is risky, but I'm still driving because some people saying using microwave is risky, but well, I'm still using microwave, right? So I accept the risk, right? Depend on the risk level. So you can have different strategies to decide how you want to manage the risks. Then let's talk about mitigation. Mitigation, there's also different ways to mitigate your risks, or we call the controls, which can be administrative, right, based on the laws, regulations, policies and the practice and the best practices and the guidelines, right? That is administrative control. And for certain time, let's see in your deployment environment, you do have sensitive data, and you do have to, for example, with your you have your software, you have your deliverables, or some sensitive data that to secure your software. Let's see, you have Amazon, we said AWS secret key, right? And you have that, and you need that to make your every API calls, right? So now, how do you prevent somebody within your organization to steal that, right? You need it, application need it. So in this situation, you may need administrative control. You control the access, right? Then we're talking about the technical or logical controls. That is, you have things built in your software. For example, have authentication, or if you're worried about you're worried about somebody is going to listen to the wire on the wire, and then you use secure protocols to prevent people to eavesdropping on the wire, right? Those are all technical controls. And of course, you can have physical controls. You lock your room, you have video surveillance system, you have gates, you have guards, etc. So those are different types of control. Now, if we go back to the diagram we have seen earlier, we have risks. Then in this, we have the risk that the attacker may steal the PII from our system. That's the risk, okay? So we can apply the control. What we can do is we encrypt this data, even if the database even if the attacker is able to access the database to take all the data, but it's encrypted, and they will not be able to actually read the data, and the patients will not be suffered, right? And I don't know if Equifax, they encrypt that data or not, probably not. So in this, now we complete the diagram, right? The risk is mitigated by the control, and the control protects the assets. Okay, so these are the basics. We now move on our second part. As I mentioned earlier, I started to do the risk assessment since 2008, and not every day, but spend a lot of time to do this. And I like to share some tips with you to help you to make your products more secure. I hope it will be helpful. Okay. So I can talk many things, but I will pick up a few things. The first thing, it is very, very, very important as a organization. The company, you may have a small company or you may have a big company, but it's important to build a culture on risk assessment. When I mean to build a culture, and what is a culture? When can we think of civilization starts, right? And you have language, you can communicate, right? So you want everyone to talk about it. Even if you have a very small company, you still want people to talk about it. That's why we say information security risk assessment. It's a very long sentence, but ISRA is something people can remember, right? It's easy to say. I have people in meetings just telling me, talking about ISRA without actually know what that means, right? But that's good. That's much better than people don't talk about it, right? Even if you have a small company. One of the talk I attended at Black Hat, it was interesting. And he has this concept. I forgot his name though. And he's like an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. He talked about the deployment of JavaScript. So there are a lot of services, and they use, and there's many startups. It's a little like an economy. Many startups, they just write JavaScript libraries. And then it says, you just need to include this one line to have this functionality, right? And so he gave a talk on how to secure the whole process of delivering the JavaScript library, right? And the one point he made was the way they makes it's a small startup, make everybody conscious about security, and he does something called tour of duty. I don't remember he called it or I called it, because I told my organization to about the idea. And he will have developers, they take turn to be the security person of the company. And each person will have several months to do it. And then by the end, everybody talk about security. So this is the same. So you want people, the security person, the management, the R&D people, the product owners, operations, you want everybody to talk about it. Of course, you have to, of course, we have to train people to do it. And also we have we set up a software security community. And by one or two people dealing with many product lines is not possible. So you want to set up a community to work on this, the risk assessment. The second point is you want to adopt your security process to the development process. Different company may have different ways to develop and they deliver their software. And traditionally, we're all using waterfalls, right? Waterfall model. I guess there are still companies who are still doing waterfall models. And then, so you define a process which would include your risk assessment, right? Would include the ISRA. And then you say, with waterfall, you have different stage of your product. You say, by this stage, you do this, by that stage, you do that, right? But if you define such a process that may not be, most likely cannot be applicable to if other teams, they have agile process. They have this sprints, 1 to 4 weeks goes very quickly. So you want your process to adapt to the development process. Okay, and also your teams may have a continuous delivery, and then how do you deal with that? You have to, figure out. You make sure your security process do not block your business process. Your software development and the delivery process is actually a business process, right? You make sure you are not blockers, but you still want to make sure that you want everyone to be conscious. They still, even if they have continuous delivery, you still want to maintain your security status. I claim, I may be wrong, ISRA is a journey. And I remember when my kids were young, we go on a road trip, and they will say, "Mommy, are we there yet?" I'm sure many of you had experience, right? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And sometimes at work, I also hear that. And people say, "Did you do ISRA? Have we done ISRA? Has this finished?" Right? And I think it's a journey. What is important, we have to start it as soon as you can from the beginning, right? And if you already have a product, you've never done it before, and you want to do it as soon as you can. And if you are developing a new product, or if you're adding new features to your existing product, you want to do it ISRA as soon as possible. I'm not saying you at the beginning, but as soon as possible. It is possible you do it at the very beginning. For example, your marketing comes saying, well, this customer wants this. They want to do it this way. And then you have to think about it. Technically, it is doable. You haven't done design, you haven't done architecture change, you have not done any coding. Before you do anything, you look at this requirement from the security perspective. If we add this, how would it reduce or how it affect our security posture? So you want to do it, at that early if you have the requirement, even before you even do the design. Of course, when you have the architecture design, you want to work with your architects to see your architecture design if it can maintain your security objectives, right? And so you also, I mentioned it's a journey. You want to, I'm probably ahead of myself, but so you want to start as early as possible. Another reason is if you start late, you postpone, and we're too busy, let's try, we don't even know if it works, right? And then you have doing some prototype, oh, it works pretty good, and then why don't you just deliver, right? Or your marketing gave you a timeline. You didn't do your ISRA until very late, then you realize a problem, right? You did your ISRA, you find out there's a major vulnerability. There's a big risk. Then what do? Your deadline is there, right? And you don't have time to change design. And we had experience that we did it early and we have enough time. We changed the design. We didn't implement our original design. Instead, we implement an alternative design because of ISRA, right? If you do it late, you don't have time. Then I don't know what you do, right? You either postpone, you either postpone your product or you release your product with the risk, and then you cannot sleep. Another thing, based on my experience, I think it is very important to know the product, to know your product. You want to know what's the purpose, what are the use cases, what are the assets, the design, the protocol. You want to, with a given amount of time, you want to know as much as possible about your product. And looking at the checking list, there's some checklist, right? And OWASP has some checklist, and CSA has a cloud security matrix. There are things you can check. However, if you don't know your product, you may not know how to answer, or you can only answer surface level questions, right? So for me, I have, and I guess also due to my curiosity, I have to know the product. I have to know how it's doing, and then that will help. That will help you to identify the risks and the vulnerabilities. Okay, so let's see you identified all your risks. You need to evaluate the risk levels. If you have a lot of vulnerabilities, for example, you run if you run your scanner, you have a lot of vulnerabilities, and then many times, if you look at the result of scanner, and they may list dozens of them, but it's probably caused by one thing, right? And somewhere you use the JavaScript, you use eval or something, and it can list the dozens of the same dozens of items. And for that thing, if you can just fix it, right? It takes time to evaluate the risk. But otherwise, you identified a dozen of risks, right? You want to evaluate them to see which one is high risk, which one is medium, which one is low. You want to, because you have limited resources, so you want to focus on those which has higher risks. So that's why when you evaluate the risk, you basically prioritize your tasks, right? Without it, it's very difficult for product owners to prioritize. Sometimes, even if you among 10, you identified 3, okay? And then what you do, right? You want to look a little bit further to see, okay, for these 3, what are the effort you have to do, right, in order to fix it, right? What are the problem if you don't fix it? So you want to provide more information for management to make a decision. If you can, do propose mitigations, or we call it controls. Otherwise, otherwise people don't trust you, right? You say you have these risks, and then they say, then what do I do? And if there's no solution, then just don't do anything. Then your vulnerability or your risk will still be there, right? So you want to focus on critical and high risk items, and in order to do that, you really have to equip yourself. You have to have enough domain knowledge, right? So it depends on which domain you are in. If you're developing a software for real estate, you really want to have some domain knowledge in real estate, right? If you develop software for health services, and you really want to know, you want to know what are the standards and what are the standard practices. So you want to use standard protocols, use standard as much as possible. And for example, you want to, let's see an example. So you have a product, which your product will talk with third party to get resources, which the user is the owner of the resource. The example, your product, let's say, access Facebook, and to access some, what do they call it? The Facebook, the graph, connection graph, whatever it's called, but you need to get the user's permission. Then your product, you will need to have user's password, right? You could set it up so that the user will enter the password, then you pass to Facebook, then you get the data about this user. Right, but this is very bad, right? Because you force the user to disclose his information, his password, in another site, which is not yours, right? And on your product, it is not it's not good either. You don't really want to know, because if you know the user's information, you have to protect it, right? So you have the risk that your product will, if you have vulnerabilities in your product, and somebody may steal this user's password. So you have these risks. Then in this case, if you have domain knowledge in identity management, you know there are standard protocols called OAuth. You use OAuth too, that your product will never see the user's password, and you can still access user's resource in a limited amount of time. So you really want to have your domain knowledge. So here are some examples. So the threat is spoofing, right? And in this case, someone claimed to be you. So the mitigation is you have authentication, right? You have ways to authenticate it is indeed to be you. Maybe you have multi-factor authentication, right? And then another threat is tampering, right? Your data may be tampered. Somebody may tamper the binary of your product, and before you send to Amazon, or before, and also, or at AWS, right? Then what do? You add integrity protection, right? So when you identify risks, and then you want to propose, you talk with your architects, talk with your people, and you want to propose mitigations for particular risks. And why it is important? And you may not even implement it, right? Remember, we said risk management, there are 4 different ways, at least 4 different ways. You can avoid, or you mitigate, and you transfer. There's other ways. You may not even implement, but it's still important because the risk management decisions, they will look at it, okay, do we mitigate? And then they will see what is the cost of doing this mitigation, right? It will help to make management decisions. As we all know, changes are normal, right? Things always change. You have delivered a product, or you bought a third-party service, right? And then, but things can change, right? You have new features, you have new requirements, you have new assets, you may change the environment, and initially you're developing this product is for on-premise deployment. Now, everybody want to cloud transformation. You want to cloud deployment, right? So things has changed. You were using AWS, and now you have to satisfy GDPR and the European privacy regulation. Then you have to have deployment in Europe, right? So things always change. When things change, you want to look back your ISRA again to see, look back your ISRA and to see if there's no new security risk arise. If there is, you want to evaluate, you update ISRA, okay? So that's why earlier I said ISRA is a journey. You start early, and you continue to do it. Like you update often, right? So you don't stop after you did your initial version. You do want Brainstorm, and if you are your security officer, or you are the security person in your company, and by yourself, you have, I'm not saying you have, I have limited knowledge. I depend on my colleagues. I talk with my colleagues, and I talk with the R&D teams, and to understand what they do, and you do some brainstorming. Another thing is you do want to talk with people. On the other hand, everybody, they're always busy because they have continuous delivery and they have very short cycle. They are always busy. So you also want to respect their time. So what I normally do, if I want to ask some some people. And they will say how much time you need. And if it's long, it have to after the deadline, well, which is this Friday. And I say half hour. Sometimes I say 15 minutes. So, and then it's okay. And so then you learn, but you formulate. You do your own study, and you formulate the questions. You ask specific questions, and that will save other people's time. You want to track your issues in your ISRA. You identify the vulnerabilities, and you create tickets in your bug tracking system. You want to know the progress. So you want to make sure you are not wasting your time, and you want to sure your product is improving. This is obvious. Protect your documents. That's all I have. Thank you.